So let's take a look at some environmental hazards that you could certainly encounter at some point throughout your time in real estate. And I think a lot, in fact, pretty much all of what we're about to go over right now, I would think would be common sense, but just in case, obviously, if you have knowledge of some environmental hazard that exists with the property you're trying to sell, do you think that would have to be disclosed? Do you think that would be a mandatory disclosure? Obviously, yes. Even if your seller, for whatever reason, decides not to disclose a known hazard, you as a real estate agent, you have to disclose it, whether they want to or not. Because it's the law. The law says you must disclose environmental hazards. And the reason I wanted to point this out is because you potentially could have a seller, a client, that says, no, I don't want to disclose it because, one, I don't believe it's that big a deal, but it might be enough to keep a buyer from wanting to buy it, and I'm telling you as my agent, I want this kept confidential. Well, we know confidentiality is a fiduciary duty you owe to your client. So what do? Do you comply with what your seller said? Your seller said, keep it confidential. Do not disclose it. Well, no. Your seller can't tell you to keep something confidential if the law says it has to be disclosed. Okay? So they can't they can't make you do something illegal. So you make sure, assuming you have knowledge of any of these issues we're about to go over, even if your seller says, I don't want to and I don't want you to disclose, you have to. You have to disclose it. So, let's take a look at some examples of environmental hazards. Now, most, if not all of these, you're probably familiar with or heard of. But if there's any you're not, make sure you know what they are, because I'm telling you, you will be tested on them. But the first example is asbestos. Obviously, asbestos is used in a lot of building materials, or was back in the day, I guess. But we've now learned that asbestos can cause some serious health problems, especially when it comes to lungs. If you breathe it in, if asbestos becomes friable, meaning the particles become airborne, you breathe it in. It can cause some serious lung diseases and issues and stuff like that. So where do you find asbestos? It could be in almost anything, especially in older homes. Because I'm telling you, asbestos was a very common building material. And there's a reason for it. In fact, a couple of reasons. One, asbestos, it's the best insulation you can get. It's a very good insulator, number one. And number two, it's fire retardant. It doesn't burn. So for that reason, that would seem to be a very good material to use when you're constructing buildings. The best insulation you can get, and it's fire retardant. It seems like a no-brainer. Unfortunately, we find out now it will kill you, but other than that, it's pretty good building material. But you see it in things like, and again, older houses like in the 70s and before. I will tell you, just giving you some examples of where they used asbestos. You could go into a lot of kitchens, again, in the older homes. A lot of the floor looks like a vinyl or linoleum type flooring. That was typically built with or made with asbestos. There's a lot of asbestos in there. And you see contractors, when they go into to remodel homes, older homes like that, they're just in there with a shovel, just digging it up, tearing it up and stuff. And they're not wearing any kind of face mask a lot of times, and it just blows my mind. I can only assume they don't realize that that's most likely asbestos they're breathing in. They used it in a lot of your fireplaces, wood stoves. They use it a lot. But then you've also got exterior siding made out of asbestos siding. We use that for the exterior of the home. Obviously, so if you know asbestos is in or on that property, then you have to disclose that. If that exterior siding is asbestos, then you got to disclose that. Make sure buyers have a right to know that. Now, if there's asbestos siding around the house, does that mean we got an environmental hazard per se? Not necessarily. Again, the asbestos will not hurt you or harm you unless it becomes friable, meaning you break it into pieces and its particles released in the air to breathe. So as long as you don't break the siding, you're probably okay. It's not likely going to be that big a deal. But if you've got broken parts of it, then that could create an environmental hazard for sure. But now I will tell you, it's very hard. It's a very hard material. So, if you break it, something hard had to have hit it at some point. But that's asbestos. Underground storage tanks, or USTs, you hear it referred to quite a bit. Again, these were very common with older properties. And when I say older properties, don't get hung up on the date that I'm about to throw out, but typically it seems like in the 70s and before, we did things that we didn't realize were harmful, I guess, at the time. But it was around the 70s when we started figuring out that some of the things that we're doing are, in fact, environmental hazards. So we've cleaned that up and we don't do it anymore. But it's, some of this happened a little after the 70s, some a little before, but it's right around the 70s. So, if you're dealing with a house, helping a buyer, built prior or in the 70s or before, or you lived in a house in the 70s or before, that's when you need to probably pay more attention to some of these potential hazards for sure, because they could exist. And one of these, again, is this underground storage tank. And they use these tanks for fuel oil. A lot of houses today, they heat with fuel oil. Well, obviously you got to have a tank to put the fuel in order to heat the house. Well, it used to be that the tank would be like on the side of the house or maybe behind the house, but it was above ground typically. But then we got to the point where we didn't like these above ground tanks. They were just unsightly. They didn't look good. So we decided to bury the tanks so that you couldn't see them. And that's why they come underground storage tanks. Well, obviously, if you put a metal tank in the ground, over time, what's going to happen to that metal tank? It's going to start to rust. It's going to start to corrode. And before you know it, the tank's now leaking. So you got fuel oil leaking into the ground. That contaminates groundwater. It can cause all kind of issues. So they changed the law requiring that you cannot use or have or use underground storage tanks. They have to be kept above ground. Well, when they changed the law, those that had underground tanks, they basically gave them an option on how to comply with the law. Obviously, you could dig the tank up and put it back above ground. That would be one way. Well, if you think that was an unsightly looking tank before they put it in the ground, you pull something out of the ground that's been there for many years, it's really going to look unsightly. So what most homeowners did is they just put a new tank above ground that they're now using, but they left the old tank still in the ground. Even though they're not using it, it's still in the ground. Well, that can cause issues, especially if a vehicle or something heavy drives over the top of where this tank is, y'all, it could collapse, y'all, because it's rusting and corroding. Y'all, it could collapse. Somebody could get hurt, hopefully, and potentially badly. So, y'all, for that reason, y'all, if there are still any underground storage tanks on the property, even though they're not being used, y'all, it has to be disclosed. Y'all, you could actually still have at least some fuel oil in those tanks. And eventually, if they're not already leaking fuel oil, y'all, it could leak it, y'all. And again, that's going to contaminate your groundwater. Y'all, so all of this could create an environmental hazard for sure. So if you know they're there, it has to be disclosed. Now, first of all, how are you going to know if there's a tank in the ground? Y'all, typically there's a pipe that will be sticking up out of the ground. Okay, y'all, that's how they would fill it with fuel oil, right? That open up, there'd be a lid on the pipe that open up the lid, pump the fuel oil into it, and then hopefully just close the lid. So occasionally, you'll be walking around some of these houses, and they're typically in the backyard, sometimes on the side yard. You'll see a little pipe, about a foot, about 12 to 18 inches, something like, sticking up out of the ground. Well, there's your clue. There's probably a storage tank underneath there. There's a reason pipes are sticking out of the ground, okay? So you got to kind of look into that kind of stuff for sure. All right, so there's your underground storage tanks. The next potential hazard is called radon. Y'all, radon is a gas that comes out of the ground. And now, obviously, if you breathe it in, it could cause some health issues for sure. The problem with this gas is, one, it's colorless, it's odorless, and it's tasteless. But it is a radioactive gas, and again, it can cause health problems if it is inhaled or breathed in. So if it's colorless, odorless, and tasteless, it means you can't see it, you can't smell it, and you can't taste it. Well, how would you know if radon is even an issue? You'd have to have a radon test, okay? Now, obviously, so when this gas comes up out of the ground, and by the way, what causes the gas? It's rocks, boulders, thing below the surface of the ground. As the surface as the earth is rotating, it could it causes rocks to kind of grind and shift and so forth. Well, as it does, that's what creates this gas. And it'll eventually seep up out of the ground and into the air. Now, once it hits the air, it will typically just dissipate, and then there's no issues. The problem is if that gas comes out of the ground right underneath your home, and it's able to actually penetrate, get inside into the interior of your house before it can dissipate. That's where this becomes an environmental issue. So a few things you need to understand about this radon. First of all, what homes would be most susceptible to radon? And the answer would be any house that is built that has any living area, either below the surface of the ground or closest to the ground. Okay, obviously, if you have a basement, that's below the surface. So if the gas comes up right up where your basement is, it can't dissipate. It will come right straight into the basement. Now, typically you got a concrete slab for the basement, but even without a basement, a lot of houses are just built on concrete slabs. So they're not in the ground, but they're extremely close to the ground because they're just sitting on top of that concrete slab. Well, can that gas go through that concrete slab? Absolutely. In fact, won't even slow it down. Concrete's a very coarse material. Water can penetrate concrete. Gas will have no problem going through that concrete. It will go right through it. So if they ask you the question, which of the following buildings or structures would be most susceptible to radon? I would be looking for a property that either has living area below the surface of the ground or closest to the ground. If you have a house that's built on that has crawl space underneath, obviously the more crawl space you have, and assuming you got your vents open, it's ventilated underneath there, there's a pretty good chance, that gas, even if it comes up out of the ground under your house, it could dissipate in the crawl space before it could actually get in the house. But it would depend a lot on how much space you have in your crawl space, how well the ventilation is, and stuff like that. But that's what you need to understand about radon. Now I'll tell you something else you need to understand too. In fact, they may even ask you something like this. Do newer homes, because of the way they're constructed today, do newer homes offer any more protection from radon than an older home would? Absolutely not. No, new homes are no way protect you from radon any more than an older home would. So it doesn't matter what the age of the home is. What matters is how much living area is below the surface or how close to the ground the structure sits, right? So that's what you need to understand about radon. Okay. The next environmental hazard is EFOS. EFOS is it's an environment. It's an artificial stucco. So basically, it looks like stucco siding. If you're familiar with stucco siding, now I will tell you, some states have a lot more problems with this than other states for some reason. I don't know why that would be, but it is what it is. But I can tell you, in where I live, I'm in South Carolina, and South Carolina has some serious problems with this EFOS or artificial stucco. First of all, what is stucco? If you've ever seen a house, it looks like it's just like concrete siding, cement. They just take cement and just spread it all over the house. Okay, that's kind of like stucco siding. But the artificial stucco is not cement. It's more of a synthetic material. It doesn't bleed as well as concrete, right? Concrete, if it was actually concrete, moisture can actually go through it. In fact, we talked about that a second ago. But this synthetic stucco, it doesn't breathe as well. Okay, moisture cannot go through it very well. So what will happen a lot of times, at least in South Carolina, now other states are not having this issue. I don't know why it is, but it is. But if any moisture is able to get in between this siding, this artificial stucco siding, if it gets in between the siding and the house, by the time you realize you got a problem, it's too late. You almost have to just go ahead and just bulldoze the house and start over. Because what's happening here is, that moisture that gets up between the siding and the house, it starts to rot all the wood, the framing around the house. It's rotted. So it's just caused a lot of problems here. So I know in South Carolina, we have to disclose to buyers if there is artificial stucco or this EFOS that's being used on the exterior siding. We must disclose that this could be a hazard to you. You better get a really good inspection done to make sure you're not having any kind of moisture issues with this siding. Okay, but again, other states are using it, and they're not having near the problems that we are here in South Carolina. So, I guess it's going to vary from state to state. All right, mold, and specifically toxic mold. Obviously, I would think most everybody knows what mold is, and we also know mold can cause some serious health issues. But yeah, if you know you have mold in the property, then yeah, again, that has to be disclosed. Now, you need to be careful about, in fact, I want to tell you, home inspectors, for example, at least all the ones I ever deal with, they pretty much refrain from using the word mold. That's like a 4-letter word that we don't use. Because apparently, there's a difference between mold and toxic mold. I'm not an expert there. And not that you need to be either. But, so, you want to be careful when you say, oh, there's mold in the house. Okay, well, there's a difference between mold and toxic mold, apparently. And you don't know whether it's toxic or not. So, you got to be careful about the vocabulary you use in this area. What a lot of inspectors might say, for example, if they see something that looks like mold, they will use the word fungus, for example. They might say there is a fungus or an active fungus or growth in the crawl space or wherever they see it. And recommend you get an expert to come out and test it and see what's going on here. But we try to stay away from using the term mold until it's been tested and now once it's tested and it comes back as toxic mold, then you got to disclose that. But until you know it's toxic mold, you do need to disclose there is a growth or a fungus here. Don't know if it's toxic or not. It needs to be tested. Okay? So just be careful with that one. All right. This next hazard is lead-based paint. Now, I will tell you, this is one that you will be dealing with on a routine basis throughout your practice in real estate. Lead-based paint, again, back in the day, back in the 70s and before primarily, lead-based paint was very common. Obviously that's different than a water-based paint. But lead-based paint, the reason they like to use it is because it's so durable. You paint something with lead paint, it was going to stay painted for a long time. It's just a very durable paint. Unfortunately, we now learn that the lead in the paint can cause, again, some serious health issues. Could the house you live in have lead paint? Potentially. But what you need to know for real estate purposes and for test and exam purposes, any house built prior to 1978, and you better remember that date. You're going to see that date over and over again. Any property built prior to 1978, it could very well have lead paint in the house. The lead-based paint was outlawed in 1977. So anything up through that point, there's a good chance there's lead-based paint in the house, on the walls and whatnot. Now, chances are it's been painted over with with a water-based paint, but that doesn't change the fact there's still lead paint underneath, right? Or potentially there could be. So basically, there is a legal mandatory disclosure that must be made to all buyers. Anybody buying property that was built prior to 78, you must disclose to them that because the house was built prior to 78, it potentially could have some lead paint in the house. The buyer would then have an option. They could have, it's usually like a 10-day period to have a lead-based paint inspection done. And if they don't like the results of it, that could be grounds to terminate the contract and walk away. But I will tell you, it just seems, I don't think most people are too alarmed by it because, another option the buyer has is they could waive their rights to have a lead-based paint inspection performed. But, what we're talking about here, a couple things have to happen. We just said that we have to disclose the potential of lead-based paint. When you have to disclose something, it has to be in writing. You just can't say, but I told them. No, that ain't going to work. If you don't have a written disclosure signed by that buyer acknowledging everything that we're talking about here, then you didn't disclose it. So there is a lead-based paint disclosure form that must be filled out and signed by the buyer, the seller, and any agents that are involved with the transaction must also sign it. That form is required, again, on every house or property built prior to 1978. Okay? The second thing you must do with a house prior to 78, you got to provide them with a copy of it. It's an EPA pamphlet. It's called Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. You see a little picture up there on the slide. But it's several pages. It's a pretty thick pamphlet there. And again, you have to provide that pamphlet, to help give them some knowledge and understanding, education about lead-based paint. And then on that disclosure form, they have to either choose. I either waive my rights to a lead paint inspection, or I choose to take the 10-day period and get a lead paint inspection done. So, that form has to be filled out, and this EPA pamphlet must be provided as well. Okay? I promise you that's going to be on the test, and you're going to be dealing with that on a daily basis in real estate anyway. All right. Wetlands, another environmental hazard. Wetlands are typically protected areas. Okay, you could have certain different types of species, animals that live in these wetland areas, and if you go in there and mess up the environment or the wetlands, if you will, you could endanger some of these species that we're trying to protect. So, could you actually own land that has a wetlands, environmentally protected area on your property? Yes, you can. A lot of people do. Well, what can you do with it? Look at it. That's about it. You cannot go in there and try to fill it in, clean it up. You cannot go in there and disturb what has been deemed a wetlands area, environmentally protected area. So obviously, if you're selling or buying property that has a wetlands included with that property, the buyer has a right to know that. So it has to be disclosed. Okay. And then I think this might be the last of the environmental hazards, but there's something called a brownfields site. The brownfield just means it's a contaminated hazardous site. Fuel oil maybe has spilled and leaked into the ground, something of that nature. So it's now considered a contaminated or hazardous site. That's what we call brownfields. Okay. Well, there are laws that have been passed now by the government, obviously, to try to clean up or try to assist in the cleanup of some of these hazardous sites, again, so we can use the property again. Well, there's this what they call the BUILD Act that reauthorized the EPA to basically provide funds and relief to try to clean up some of these contaminated areas. We want to get them cleaned up. We don't want to just let them sit there and not being used. We actually want to clean it up. Now, what all does this BUILD Act do? There are grants available through the government. Grants where you can actually receive money. You don't have to pay it back, but it's used to actually clean up some of these hazardous contaminated areas. It also limited some of the liability for those that are trying to clean up, trying to do the right thing. But y'all, is it possible that we feel like something is clean and if it's good, they sell it and it's not cleaned or not completely clean and somebody gets sick or hurt? Y'all think, I guess it could happen. So, y'all, through this act, y'all, it does reduce some of the liability that could potentially fall on owners or developers and stuff like that. But anyway, y'all, that's what the brownfield law does. It's just a way to try to clean up some of these contaminated sites, so that we can use them again. So those are your environmental hazards that you need to understand.